Welcome to Mr. Nightmare Scares You. For new listeners joining us for the first time, prepare to delve into the darkest side of the world. And for our loyal subscribers who already know the spine-chilling feeling, turn off the lights and lock the doors, because today's story will test the limits of your fear. Before we begin the story, let's meet the person who lived through this terrifying experience. Marcus, 34, from Charlotte, North Carolina, shared this story that will forever change how you see the darkness of the forest. I've always been the type of person who seeks isolation to clear my mind. Life in Charlotte can be chaotic, and nature has always been my refuge. That particular week in November, I decided to do a multi-day solo hike in a dense, largely unexplored area of the forests bordering the Blue Ridge Parkway. I knew the area well, or at least I thought I did. The plan was to hike about 30 miles over rough terrain and camp in the heart of the forest, far from any tourist-mapped trails. I didn't have a vehicle with me. It had been dropped off at the start of a secondary trail by a friend and wouldn't be picked up for 4 days many miles away. The weather was harsh. When I started hiking in the mid-afternoon, the thermometers already showed about 45 degrees Celsius, and the frigid air burned my lungs with every deep breath. The weight of my backpack, with nearly 60 pounds of survival gear, felt like it anchored me to the ground, but the somber beauty of the mountains compensated for the physical exertion. The Blue Ridge Parkway is famous for its stunning scenery, but there's a side to these mountains that postcards never show. When you stray off the main roads and into the dense woods, the ancient trees seem to bend over you, creating a natural canopy that blocks much of the sunlight. As the hours passed, a thick grey fog began to roll down the slopes, engulfing tree trunks and limiting my vision to no more than 30 feet. The once peaceful environment quickly became claustrophobic. The dampness of the fog clung to my skin, and the cold began to penetrate my layers of clothing. I kept marching, focused on finding a flat area near some water source to set up camp before darkness took over, unaware that each step was leading me into territory that shouldn't exist. The first thing you learn when you spend a lot of time in the forest is that it's never truly silent. There's always the rustling of leaves under the weight of small rodents, the late-night birdsong, the buzzing of insects, or the sound of the wind cutting through the treetops. However, around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when the sunlight had already turned into an anemic glow through the mist, the forest simply shut down. It was abrupt, as if someone had cut the power to all living things around me. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, and even the wind seemed to have died. The only sound echoing among the monumental trunks was the heavy impact of my own boots against the damp earth and gravel. This kind of absolute silence in the wilderness usually means only one thing: the presence of a large predator. The local fauna knows when to hide. I stopped walking and adjusted the straps of my backpack, trying to control my breathing to hear better. The temperature had dropped even further, nearing 38 degrees Celsius, and my breath formed small white clouds in front of my face. I began to scan the perimeter with my gaze, forcing my vision through the dense veil of fog. The feeling of being watched hit the back of my neck like an electric shock. It wasn't just a passing paranoia of someone alone in the woods. It was a primal, overwhelming instinct, screaming that I wasn't the only one there. I felt the weight of a focused gaze on me, studying my movements with malicious intelligence. My mind tried to rationalize the situation. I told myself it could be a curious deer or even a lone coyote, but the weight of that presence in the air was immense. There was a dense, hostile energy that made me want to turn around and run frantically to the highway. Even though I was afraid, I needed to find a safe place to spend the night, so I forced my legs to keep moving, gripping the handle of my hunting knife tightly in the sheath attached to my belt. About a mile further on, I found a small clearing near a narrow stream. The sound of the running water helped break the maddening silence, bringing a false sense of relief. I dropped my heavy backpack onto the leaf-covered ground and began to unpack my tent equipment. The sun had almost completely disappeared, leaving behind a dark purple twilight. I grabbed my canteen and tactical flashlight to collect some water and boil it before it got completely dark. As I bent down on the muddy bank of the stream, the beam of light from my flashlight revealed something that made my stomach drop. Deep embedded in the cold, damp mud was a footprint. At first, my mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. It looked like the print of a dog or a wolf, with distinct paw pads and sharp claw marks sunk into the earth. But the size was utterly impossible. I pulled out a small ruler I carry in my emergency kit and measured the mark with trembling hands. The footprint was an impressive 14 inches long and almost 7 inches wide. No wolf on the face of the earth comes close to those proportions. Furthermore, the depth of the mark in the dense mud indicated that the creature that passed by easily weighed over 400 pounds. I illuminated the surroundings to follow the trail and made an even more terrifying discovery. The footprints continued in a straight line along the bank, but there weren't 4 paw prints as usual. There were only 2, perfectly alternating. The distance between each step was almost 5 feet. The creature that left those marks was walking on 2 legs, with a bipedal posture frighteningly similar to that of a human being, but with an animalistic anatomy. Panic began to spread through my veins. I slowly retreated from the bank, completely forgetting the water I had gone to collect. I was in the territory of something colossal and unknown, and night was only beginning to fall. Back in the clearing, I pitched my tent in record time, driven by a massive adrenaline rush. The temperature had plummeted to a relentless 30 degrees, and the cold was already stiffening my joints, but I was sweating profusely beneath my heavy winter clothes. I lit a small fire with the dry wood I could gather, hoping the light and heat would keep any wild things at bay. That's when the smell hit me. It came with a sudden gust of icy wind, an odor so thick and repulsive it made me gag violently. It was a nauseating mixture of decaying flesh, rusted copper, and the musky, foul smell of a kennel that hadn't been cleaned in months. The stench invaded my nostrils and clung to the back of my throat, churning my stomach. I'd found animal carcasses in the forest before, but this was different. The smell seemed to carry an aura of active death, a putrefaction that exuded heat and life. I knew that thing was close. The odor floated around the camp, encircling the clearing as if the source were stealthily moving through the invisible perimeter beyond the campfire light. My heart pounded so hard against my ribs that I swore the sound could be heard through the trees. I sat on a fallen log facing the fire, my extinguished flashlight in one hand and a camp axe in the other. I tried to peer into the impenetrable darkness of the forest. The smell intensified with each passing minute, indicating that the creature was deliberately closing in around my camp. The fear I felt was primal and paralyzing. I felt exactly like cornered prey, awaiting the moment of slaughter. It was around 10 o'clock at night that the psychological torture transformed into absolute visual terror. The moon finally managed to pierce through some of the dense cloud cover and fog, casting a ghostly, silvery light through the black tree trunks. The fire had already been reduced to orange embers, and I didn't dare get up to fetch more firewood. I kept my eyes fixed on the line of trees about 60 feet away, from where the putrid smell emanated most oppressively. Suddenly, the silhouette of a massive tree seemed to move. My breath caught in my throat as I strained my eyes to the exact spot. It wasn't a tree. It was him. The figure emerged from the shadows, standing out against the dim moonlight. He stood upright, supported on 2 incredibly muscular and thick legs. The monster's height was staggering. I estimate he was easily 8 feet tall, perhaps more. His fur appeared dark, pitch black, or a very dense grey, blending into the surrounding darkness. His shoulders were abnormally broad, thick, and full of raw power, supporting a head that combined the features of a demonic wolf with the distorted proportions of something human. His ears were pointed and erect, capturing every sound, while his long arms ended in colossal hands equipped with claws that resembled curved scythes. But what paralyzed my soul were his eyes. They reflected the dim ambient light with a cruel, yellowish gleam. He wasn't acting like a wild animal driven by blind instinct. He was analyzing me, absorbing my fear, perfectly aware of the absolute terror he was causing. I was face to face with a living legend, and I had never felt so insignificant and close to death in my entire life. To understand the gravity of my situation, you need to grasp the unforgiving vastness of this region. The Blue Ridge Parkway isn't just a pretty spot for autumn photos. It cuts through one of the world's oldest and most isolated mountain systems. When you stray off the marked trails, you enter unforgiving, pristine territory. I was camped at the bottom of a bowl-shaped valley, surrounded by steep granite slopes and a pine and oak forest so dense that sunlight struggled to reach the ground even at midday. There was no cell phone signal within at least 40 miles. I was completely disconnected from civilization, without any form of communication, isolated in a green and black ocean of undergrowth and ancient trees. My mind desperately tried to calculate the exact distance to the nearest village. I knew I would have to hike uninterrupted for about 25 miles through treacherous terrain full of loose rocks and exposed roots to find the first paved trail. And even then, I would be vulnerable at every step. The temperature continued to plummet, now hovering around 25 degrees Celsius, and the extreme cold made the situation even more desperate. My extremities began to ache, and my fingers, gripping the axe handle, were numb and white. That particular area of the mountains always carried a heavy energy, a somber tone that even the most experienced hikers prefer to avoid at nightfall. The ancient natives used to avoid valleys like that one, believing they harbored corrupted spirits of nature. At that moment, paralyzed with terror before that titanic creature, I understood exactly why. I wasn't an experienced hiker enjoying nature. I was an intruder in an ancient domain, and the lord of that forest stood right before me, gauging my fear. I couldn't blink. My eyes burned from the faint smoke of the dying campfire, but the terror of closing my eyelids for even a fraction of a second, and having that thing advance on me kept me in a morbid state of hypervigilance. The creature took a subtle step forward, partially emerging from the protection of the deepest shadows, and the silvery moonlight revealed details that will be etched in my memory until my last breath. Its physical structure was an abomination that defied all the laws of natural biology. The monster's chest was as broad as the trunk of a massive oak tree, covered in muscles so defined and taut they looked like steel cables coiled beneath its thick, dark fur. With each slow, calculated breath it took, dense clouds of vapor rose from its elongated snout, mingling with the icy mist hovering about 3 feet above the damp ground. Its head was a vision straight from hell. The long snout, resembling that of a monstrous wolf, ended in black lips that curved backward, exposing rows of jagged yellowish teeth sharp enough to crush thick bones with the same ease with which we break dry twigs. Its hind legs possessed the classic curvature of canids, which made its ability to stand perfectly bipedally all the more disturbing and unnatural. The creature exuded a pungent heat that seemed to carry the unbearable smell of death, old flesh, and churned earth. That fetid, coppery odor seeped into my nostrils and burned my throat, causing paralyzing nausea. It was less than 50 feet from me, and I could see its muscles contracting beneath its skin with every small movement, as if it were containing a colossal, destructive force for sheer sick amusement. It was at that moment that true psychological terror set in. Common predators like pumas or coyotes attack out of hunger or territorial defense. They act quickly, efficiently, and guided by pure animal instinct. But that creature was no simple animal. Its yellow eyes, gleaming with a malevolent luminescence in the dim light, demonstrated a cruel and sadistic level of intelligence. It was playing with me. It knew I was armed only with a hunting knife and a camping axe, tools that would be utterly useless against its mass of over 400 pounds of pure muscle and fury. The monster began to slowly shift its weight from one leg to the other, transferring its colossal mass fluidly without making a single sound on the leaf-covered ground. With each small lateral movement he made, I felt my heart pound in my chest so hard that my vision momentarily blurred. He was studying me, watching my panic increase with each beat of my heart. Intense, raw fear is a feeling that alters your perception of reality. Time seemed to have frozen. I felt every drop of icy sweat running down my spine, even with the air temperature nearing a relentless 20 degrees Celsius. I tried to take a step back, very slowly, towards the door of my tent, in the naive hope that a thin nylon fabric might offer me some protection against an 8-foot-tall demon. As soon as I moved my boot a few inches back, the creature stopped its swaying and lowered its gigantic head slightly, focusing its yellow gaze directly on my soul. The message was clear and immediate. Any sudden movement would result in my instant death. Many people search for scary stories online purely for entertainment, reading accounts and myths, to feel a slight thrill of excitement in the comfort of their safe homes. I myself had heard the old local legends about encounters with dogmen in the deepest and oldest parts of the Appalachians. The oldest residents of small rural towns often speak in hushed tones about forest demons, nightwalkers, or half-man, half-wolf beasts that lurk in valleys where sunlight doesn't reach. I always dismissed it all as cheap regional folklore, created to steer careless tourists away from dangerous trails and prevent them from getting lost. But there, frozen in the darkness under the gaze of an impossible alpha predator, all those legends crashed down on my mind with the overwhelming weight of an indisputable fact. Those weren't just stories to scare children around a campfire. They were bloody warnings I chose to ignore. I remembered the countless missing persons posters we see affixed to the entrances of national parks, the frozen smiles in faded photographs of hikers who supposedly got lost, suffered fatal falls, or succumbed to the elements. Suddenly, the forest around me took on the appearance of a vast clandestine cemetery. The utter terror of knowing I would be just another smiling face printed on a paper flyer, while my body disappeared forever into the bowels of those remote mountains, brought me indescribable despair. The creature before me was the very reason why ancient forests have always been feared and respected. It was pure nightmare incarnate, the primordial shadow from which humanity has fled and tried to forget since the beginning of time. The night dragged on in a slow, silent torture. The monster didn't advance into my camp, but it didn't leave either. It remained at the edge of the ever-diminishing light of my campfire, merging with the thick darkness of the trees. I spent hours standing, my arms aching and heavy from holding the axe at chest height, the cold punishing my body mercilessly. The wind began to blow harder across the valley, scattering the ashes of my dead campfire and violently shaking the tops of the tall trees. The smell of decay wavered, sometimes receding slightly, only to return with a suffocating force a few minutes later. This meant it was circling my camp, patrolling the invisible edge of my fragile refuge within a 100-foot radius, making sure I knew I was completely trapped. As the first faint lights of dawn began to stain the dark grey sky, the temperature reached its critical point. The fog, which had receded slightly during the early morning, returned with redoubled intensity, once again engulfing the perimeter of the clearing in a thick, damp blanket. It was then that I realized the massive silhouette had vanished. There was no sound of heavy footsteps receding, nor the rustling of breaking branches. It simply dissolved into the mist like a monstrous spectre. The initial relief of no longer seeing those yellow eyes piercing the darkness lasted only a few seconds. I knew with a cold, sickly certainty that he hadn't given up the hunt. Dawn brought no salvation. It brought only a cruel, false hope. I needed to break camp and begin marching towards civilization immediately. Every second I remained there, I would be sealing my fate. The true test of survival and extreme terror was only about to begin. As soon as the pale grey of dawn stained the mist, I made the hardest decision of my life. Staying in the clearing meant waiting for death. I wasted no time taking down the tent or packing away my sleeping bag. I abandoned almost all my heavy supplies, cutting the weight off my back so I could move with maximum agility. I took with me only the essentials for survival: my water canteen, my compass, the hunting knife fastened tightly to my belt, and the axe clutched in my right hand. The air was freezing. The thermometers must have read around 32 degrees on that damp morning, and the cold cut into my skin like invisible blades. My destination was a secondary road about 25 miles away, through the most rugged terrain the Appalachians had to offer. I began to march. The morning mist was so thick it limited my vision to no more than 40 feet in any direction. Each tree took on the form of a twisted monster, and the shadows seemed to dance on the periphery of my field of vision, fueling my paranoia. The sepulchral silence of last night still dominated the forest. The entire ecosystem remained paralyzed, aware that the alpha predator was still patrolling its territory. I forced my legs to maintain a brisk pace, almost a light jog, but the ground covered in damp roots and loose stones made progress dangerous. A twisted ankle at that moment would be an instant death sentence. As I walked along the steep slopes, Absolute fear pumped adrenaline through every muscle in my body, masking the physical exhaustion that should have been bringing me down. The feeling of being hunted never disappeared. On the contrary, it became heavier with each mile traveled. I knew he was following me. After traveling about 5 miles without rest, the terrain began to flatten out slightly, leading into an area of ancient, gigantic oak trees. It was there that I found the first physical proof that the previous night's nightmare hadn't been a delusion caused by isolation. On the broad trunk of a centuries-old oak, there were deep claw marks tearing through the tree's thick bark. I approached cautiously, feeling a chill run down my spine. The grooves were vast, displaying the force of a tractor tearing through wood. What completely paralyzed me was the height of the markings. They started an impressive 9 feet from the ground and descended violently. No known animal in North America has that wingspan or the ability to reach such a height from the ground, much less apply the force necessary to shatter wood in that way. Less than 100 yards past that tree, the metallic smell of fresh blood filled the cold air. In the middle of a small clearing in the woods, I found the remains of an adult deer. The sight was disturbing. The animal hadn't been conventionally killed by a puma or a pack of coyotes. It appeared to have been ripped in half by sheer brute force. Steam still rose from its exposed entrails in the 30-degree air, indicating that the slaughter had occurred minutes before my arrival. There were no bite marks on the neck, only the result of colossal limbs dismembering the prey. The monster hadn't done this out of hunger, as most of the meat was intact. It did this to leave a clear message in my path. The smell of decomposition mixed with fresh blood caused a violent wave of nausea. I was walking exactly where it wanted me to walk, being herded like cattle to the slaughterhouse. From that point on, the psychological hunt reached an unbearable level. I couldn't see the creature through the dense fog and tall bushes, but I began to hear it unmistakably. With each hurried step I took, the sound of a heavy impact echoed from the left side of the trail, maintaining a perfect parallel distance. It was no longer trying to hide its presence. When I quickened my pace, its massive steps also quickened, crushing the dry vegetation and sinking into the earth with formidable weight. When I stopped abruptly from exhaustion, the sound around me ceased immediately. It was a macabre synchronicity. It possessed absolute control over the environment and over my mental state. The putrid odor of old meat and filthy kennel drifted intermittently with the icy wind currents, serving as a physical reminder that hell was walking beside me. I calculated that I still had about 15 miles to go before finding any trace of asphalt. My legs burned with fatigue, my lungs ached with each breath of the cold air, and dehydration was beginning to take its toll, but I didn't dare stop to drink water from my canteen. The tension was so thick I could feel my neck stiffen, waiting for the exact moment those claws would tear through the darkness and sink into my back. He was toying with his prey. For an encounter with Dogman to be described in terrifying stories, the witness usually needs to survive to tell the tale, and I felt my chances evaporating with every parallel step that monstrosity took in the darkness of the woods. The midday sun failed to penetrate the thick layer of grey clouds. The atmosphere remained dark, gloomy and oppressive. My path forced me down a steep, slippery ravine, ending in a natural depression hidden between 2 granite slopes. As soon as I stepped onto the damp bottom of this enclosed valley, the smell of death became a solid, almost palpable odor, clogging my nostrils. The ground beneath my boots wasn't made of dry leaves, but a white, porous carpet. I lowered my gaze and my stomach sank. The entire clearing was covered in bones. There were deer skulls, gigantic fragmented elk ribs, and other skeletal remains that I didn't want to examine closely, lest I discover they belonged to vanished humans. This wasn't just a part of the forest, it was its lair. A clandestine cemetery, hidden deep in the Appalachians, untouched by sunlight or human presence for decades. Despair gripped me. I had entered the monster's feeding sanctuary. Silence returned with brutal force, muffling even the sound of the wind in the high rocks. The horror stories of encounters on deserted roads suddenly seemed like child's play compared to the terrifying magnitude of this place. The ground creaked under the weight of my boots with every careful movement. I gripped my axe with both hands, spinning my body in a full circle, anticipating an imminent attack from any direction. The instinct for self-preservation screamed for me to run without looking back, but the uneven terrain forced a slow, methodical pace. I was trapped in the beast's dining room. Late in the afternoon, physical exhaustion and panic drained almost all my life force. The temperature plummeted drastically to around 28 degrees, signaling the arrival of another freezing and deadly night. I had managed to escape the Valley of Bones, but the feeling of being pursued reached its peak. It was then that terror materialized before my eyes. About 40 feet ahead of me, the narrow path passed between two dense clusters of pine trees. Suddenly, a colossal shadow emerged from the darkness of the trees. He was no longer walking parallel to me. He had positioned himself directly in my path. A dead tree trunk, easily weighing over 400 pounds, was thrown into the middle of the trail, with the same ease a human throws a stick into a fire. Dust and leaves flew with the dull thud of the wood against the ground. The monster stepped forward, revealing its gigantic form through the thick mist. Its black fur absorbed the little remaining daylight. Its monstrous shoulders rose and fell slowly as it breathed, releasing dense clouds of hot vapor into the freezing air. It dug its impressive claws into the fallen trunk, leaning its massive body forward in a stance of imminent attack. Its yellow eyes, gleaming with pure malice and hunger, locked directly into mine. The game of cat and mouse was over. The solitary, silent hunt was finished, and the ultimate confrontation was about to begin in that forgotten stretch of forest. The air in my lungs froze instantly. At a distance of just over 40 feet, that abomination blocked my only escape route. The dead tree trunk it had thrown onto the trail, easily weighing over 400 pounds, was embedded in the hard ground, serving as a physical barrier and a reminder of the raw power I was facing. The creature slowly rose, extending its body to its full terrifying height. It must have been nearly 9 feet tall when fully erect. Its canine head tilted slightly to the side, and its yellow eyes gleamed with wicked intelligence amidst the thick fog. The temperature around us seemed to have plummeted to an unbearable 20 degrees, and the hot steam billowing from the monster's nostrils formed dense, menacing clouds. I gripped the handle of my camp axe so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white, but deep down I knew that this rudimentary weapon was pathetic against the mountain of muscle and fury before me. The silence in the forest was deafening. There wasn't a bird's song, the rustling of leaves in the wind, or the sound of any other living being. There was only me and the dark lord of the Appalachians. He opened his colossal jaw, exposing rows of sharp stained teeth, and let out a low guttural sound that vibrated not only in the air, but directly in the bones of my chest. It wasn't the common growl of a wild animal. It was a deep frequency that caused an instinctive paralysis in any prey that heard it. He wanted me to know that my end would be slow and painful. The smell of decay, mixed with churned earth, became so suffocating that my vision began to blur. So I was face to face with the demon, and the abyss stared directly back at me. The attack came without warning or a classic hunting stance. In a fraction of a second, the monstrosity covered the 40-foot distance separating us with a speed that defied its colossal size. The force of its hind legs, propelling its 400-pound-plus body, crushed the trail stones, turning them to dust. My survival instinct kicked in, and I raised my axe in a desperate movement, trying to create a barrier between my body and the beast's claws. It was a futile attempt. Before I could even complete the movement, a black mass collided with me with the force of a high-speed freight train. The impact was so violent that I was thrown about 15 feet into the air, landing violently on my back in a cluster of thick roots and jagged rocks. The air was completely expelled from my lungs, and a sharp incandescent pain radiated down the left side of my ribs. My vision exploded in a sea of bright white dots as disorientation took over my brain. The hot, metallic taste of blood instantly flooded my mouth. I tried to prop myself up on my elbows to gasp for air, but the colossal shadow of the monster was already looming over me. It didn't immediately attack with its teeth. It placed one of its gigantic paws, equipped with 5-inch claws, heavily on my chest, pressing my already fractured ribs against the frozen ground. The weight was crushing, preventing me from breathing deeply. The bestial head descended, stopping mere inches from my face. The stench of its fetid breath was unbearable, a mixture of old flesh and disease. I could see every repulsive detail of its snout and the stiff texture of its dark fur. It was savoring my utter and complete panic. The creature's paw pressed steadily against my chest, as if testing exactly how much pressure was needed to crush my internal organs. The excruciating pain restored a fraction of mental clarity, and adrenaline temporarily masked the paralyzing terror. I realized my axe had been thrown several yards away during the impact, but my right hand instinctively reached for the leather sheath on my belt. My trembling fingers found the rough handle of my hunting knife, fitted with a 7-inch carbon steel blade. The monster opened its jaws even wider, revealing the dark throat from which that nauseating odor emanated, preparing to deliver the fatal bite to my neck. With my last reserves of strength and a pure will to live, I drew the knife from its sheath and delivered a blind, desperate upward blow, aiming at the thick limb that immobilized me. The sharp blade tore through the dense fur and sank deep into the flesh of the monster's colossal arm, just above its wrist. The impact of the knife stopped abruptly upon hitting the creature's thick bones. The monster recoiled instantly. It didn't utter a sound of pain, but a roar of absolute fury, a sound so loud and deafening that it made the dry leaves around us vibrate intensely. The giant paw was abruptly removed from my chest, giving me a chance to breathe a breath of freezing air. The creature looked at the wound and then fixed its yellow eyes, now overflowing with demonic rage, on me again. My attack hadn't incapacitated it. I had only made it infinitely more dangerous. The intimidation game was over. Now it wanted extermination. Taking advantage of the monster's fleeting distraction with the wound, I frantically dragged myself backward, using the soles of my boots to push my aching body off the trail and into the dense undergrowth. I plunged headlong into a thicket of thorny bushes and thick undergrowth. Darkness was falling rapidly, swallowing the remnants of the grey afternoon, and the temperature continued to plummet, nearing 15 degrees Celsius. With each breath, the icy air tore at my wounded ribs like ground glass. I was no longer running. I was desperately throwing myself down the mountain slopes, tearing my skin on sharp branches and constantly stumbling on the treacherous ground. I had left the main trail and was now navigating blindly through the beast's unforgiving and primal territory. The creature's fury was palpable. I could hear it tearing through obstacles in its path, smashing entire young trees and crushing rocks with its heavy feet as it pursued me into the growing darkness. The sound of destruction behind me was constant and rapid. It was closing the distance, guided not only by its perfect night vision, but by the scent of my fear and the blood that trickled from the cuts on my face and arms. Panic gripped my mind, erasing any trace of rational thought or logical navigation. I just needed to find a place, any crack or hole in the granite mountains, where that 9-foot nightmare couldn't get in. Extreme exhaustion began to weigh on my bruised muscles, and I knew that in an open race of endurance, that monstrosity would catch me in a matter of minutes. Night finally fell over the mountains, casting an impenetrable darkness beneath the canopy of ancient trees. I reached the base of a massive, steep granite cliff, my hands groping along the cold, damp rock walls for any irregularities. The sound of the monster crushing the vegetation was less than 50 feet behind me, the weight of its footsteps making the ground beneath my boots tremble. By some obscure miracle, my fingers found a deep crack in the granite wall, a narrow opening no more than 3 feet wide leading into the rock formation. I threw my battered body into the crack, pressing my shoulders against the icy, damp stone, and pushing myself as deep as I could into the darkness of that small cave until I was completely trapped, hugging my knees. That's when the noisy chase stopped. The creature had reached the base of the granite slope. The silence that followed was far more disturbing than the sound of destruction. I held my breath until my lungs burned with agony. Through the narrow opening of the crevice, a few feet from where I huddled, an immense shadow blocked the little moonlight filtering through the clouds. The smell of death invaded my small stone prison, almost making me vomit. Then the worst vision of my life materialized. The bestial head slowly descended along the side of the opening. A huge eye, gleaming with a sickly yellow hue in the darkness, stopped precisely in the crack, searching the shadowy interior where I was hiding. I could hear the repulsive sound of air being violently drawn into the monster's nostrils, sniffing wetly as it tried to capture my scent in the confined space. One of its colossal arms extended, and terrifying claws scraped the stone right at the entrance to the crevice, inches from my face, sending faint sparks and a shrill sound of scraping granite that tore at my soul. It knew perfectly well that I was inside. The creature was literally inches away. I could hear the sound of its breathing, a slow, heavy cadence that sounded like the fuel of an ancient forge. The air it exhaled was so foul that my throat tightened in spasms of nausea. Its claws, thick as human fingers but ending in razor-sharp points, continued to scrape the granite at the entrance to my crevice, an agonizing sound that echoed inside my skull. I didn't dare move a single muscle. Every fiber of my being was focused on keeping my breath at a near zero level. I knew that if it decided to enter that crevice, it probably would succeed. It might not be able to get past the gigantic trunk, but its long, flexible arms would have enough strength to pull me out as if I were a stuffed toy. The monster's patience was terrifying. He didn't go into a frenzy, didn't try to bring down the mountain. He just stood there, watching. He knew I was exhausted, injured, and trapped, with temperatures dropping to 10 degrees. He was letting me suffer from the cold and fear, waiting for me to make the fatal mistake of trying to leave or simply succumb to exhaustion and faint. My body began to tremble violently, a clear sign of the onset of hypothermia, and I had to fight the instinctive urge to move to warm myself. The yellowish eye, still gleaming in the dim light of the entrance, was like a black hole sucking away my sanity. I wondered if he was waiting for dawn, or if he was simply reveling in the absolute terror he could inflict. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. The notion of time vanished. I could feel my toes losing feeling. The pain in my fractured ribs was a constant stabbing sensation, a physical reminder that my time was running out. Suddenly, the nauseating smell diminished. The sound of heavy breathing drifted a few feet to the side. The creature stood up and, with a short, disgruntled growl, took a few steps away from the crevice's entrance. Through the crack, I saw the gigantic shadow move backward toward the dense forest. It seemed to have lost immediate interest, or perhaps it had heard something outside. I couldn't waste this chance. My heart pounding, I tried to move, but my legs were stiff and tingling from lack of circulation. With a monumental effort, I pushed my body out of the granite crevice. The frigid 8-degree air hit me like a slap. I could barely stand. The world spun and my field of vision was blurred with grey. I needed to move in absolute silence. With the knife in my left hand and the little energy I had left, I began to walk, or rather to crawl in the opposite direction from the path the monster had taken. I was leaving a trail of blood, but I had no other choice. Each step was agony, but the fear of being caught was the only thing keeping me standing. The early morning seemed endless. I walked for almost 5 miles in a state of near unconsciousness. The fog, once my enemy, was now my only ally, concealing my tracks and movements in the dense woods. As the sun began to brighten, tinging the sky a pale lavender hue, I saw a glint. It wasn't natural. It was the reflection of light on a metal plate. I forced my body forward until I reached the edge of a secondary highway, a paved road that cut through the valley. The Blue Ridge Parkway. I fell to my knees on the hard asphalt, feeling the residual heat of the previous day on the road surface. I didn't care what would happen next. I was out of the forest, out of the domain of that nightmare. Soon after, I saw the lights of a maintenance vehicle climbing the mountain. I stood up, stumbling in the middle of the road and raising my arms, screaming in a hoarse, faltering voice. The vehicle stopped with the screeching of its brakes. When the driver got out, a middle-aged man with a confused expression that turned to utter terror at my sight, I collapsed. I was covered in blood, scratches and mud, trembling uncontrollably. The man came running, but I could only whisper a single word: "Get out." I couldn't tell him what I'd seen, not yet. I just wanted to get off that mountain before the sun was fully high. Months have passed since that night, but I still feel a chill down my spine every time the temperature drops below 45 degrees. I haven't been able to go back to the trail, not even to public parks during the day. My life in Charlotte has changed. I've developed a severe phobia of dense forests and can't sleep without lights on. The doctor said my ribs have healed, but the scar that encounter left on my psyche will never close. I see those yellow eyes every time I close mine at night. I know he's there, lurking in the deep darkness of the Appalachians, waiting for the next curious soul who dares to disrespect the boundaries of his territory. The authorities found my backpack months later, in an area I didn't even remember passing through. They found nothing else, no trace of a wolf, no trace of anything that wasn't human. To them, I was just another case of severe hypothermia, accompanied by a psychotic episode. But I know the truth. I saw the anatomy of the nightmare. I felt the weight of its physical strength. And I know that what inhabits those mountains is not of this world, at least not in the way we understand nature. My experience was not a delusion. It was a brutal lesson about the dark secrets that still hide in the places we call wild. If you enjoyed this story and want to continue exploring the darker side of reality and legends like this one, be sure to support the channel. Mr. Nightmare Scares. You subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave your comment below. Have you ever felt like you were being watched in a forest, or do you have a scary story to share? Your comment helps the algorithm bring these hidden truths to more people. Share this video with that friend who swears they're not afraid of anything. The night is long, and fear is just the first layer of what lurks beyond the light. Until next time, and remember, not everything that makes noise in the forest is just the wind.